The chief object of all opening strategy is to get the pieces out quickly, off the back rank and into active play. You cannot attack, let alone try the checkmate, with one or two pieces. You must develop all of them, as each one has a job to do. A good way to begin is to release two pieces at one stroke, and this can be done by advancing one of the center pawns. This is an excellent opening move. White anchors a pawn in the center of the board and opens lines for his queen and a bishop. His next move, if he is allowed, will be 2d4. The two pawns will then control four squares on the fifth rank, c5, d5, e5 and f5, and prevent black from placing any of his pieces on those important squares. How shall black reply to white's first move? He must not waste time considering meaningless moves, such as 1h6 or 1a6. These and other aimless moves do nothing toward developing the pieces, nor do they interfere with white's threat to monopolize the center. Black must fight for an equal share of the good squares. Black must dispute possession of the center. Why all this stress on the center? Why is it so important? Pieces placed in the center enjoy the greatest freedom of action and have the widest scope for their attacking powers. A knight, for example, posted in the center, reaches out in 8 directions and attacks 8 squares. Standing at the side of the board, its range of attack is limited to 4 squares. It is only half a knight. Occupation of the center means control of the most valuable territory. It leaves less room for the enemy's pieces, and makes defense difficult, as his pieces tend to get in each other's way. Occupation of the center, or control of it from a distance, sets up a barrier that divides the opponent's forces and prevents them from cooperating harmoniously. Resistance by an army thus disunited is usually not very effective. Very good. Black insists on a fair share of the center. He fixes a pawn firmly there and liberates 2 of his pieces. Absolutely the best move on the board. The knight develops with a threat, attack on a pawn. This gains time as black is not free to develop as he pleases. He must save the pawn before he does anything else, and this cuts down his choice of reply. The knight develops towards the center, which increases the scope of his attack. The knight exerts pressure on 2 of the strategically important squares in the center, e5 and d4. The knight comes into play early in the game, in compliance with the precept, develop knights before bishops. One reason for the cogency of this principle is that the knight takes shorter steps than the bishop. It takes longer for him to get to the fighting area. The bishop can sweep the length of the chessboard in one move. Notice how the f1 bishop can reach all the way to a6, where the knight takes a hop, skip and jump to get to b5. The bishop makes it in one leap. Another purpose in developing the knights first is that we are fairly sure where they belong in the opening. We know that they are most effective on certain squares. We are not always certain of the right spot for the bishop. We may want the bishop to command a long diagonal, or we may prefer to have it pin an enemy piece. Bring out your knights before developing the bishops. At this point you will note that black must defend his e-pawn before going about his business. There are several ways to protect the pawn. He must evaluate and choose from these possibilities. 2f6, 2 queen f6, 2 queen e7, 2 bishop d6, 2 d6, and 2 knight c6. How does black decide on the right move? Must he analyze countless combinations, and try to visualize every sort of attack and defense for the next 10 or 15 moves? Let me hasten to assure you that a master does not waste valuable time on futile speculation. Instead, he makes use of a potent secret weapon, positional judgment. Applying it enables him to eliminate from consideration inferior moves, to which the average player devotes much thought. He hardly glances at moves that are obviously violations of principle. Here is what might go through his mind as he selects the right move. 2f6. Terrible. My f-pawn occupies a square that should be reserved for the knight, and it also blocks the queen's path along the diagonal. And I've moved a pawn when I should be developing pieces. 2 Queen f6. Bad, since my knight belongs at f6, not the queen. Also, I'm wasting the power of my strongest piece to defend a pawn. 2 Queen e7. This shuts the f8 bishop in, while my queen is doing a job which a lesser piece could handle. 2 Bishop d6. I've developed a piece, but the d-pawn is obstructed, and my c8 bishop may be buried alive. 2 d6. Not bad, since it gives the c8 bishop an outlet. But wait, it limits the range of the f8 bishop, and again I've moved a pawn when I should be putting pieces to work. 2 Knight c6. Eureka! This must be best, as I have developed a piece to its most suitable square and protected the e-pawn at the same time. Without going into tedious analysis, Black picks out the best possible move. He follows the advice of the Frenchman who said, "Sortez les pieces." He brings a piece out and saves the e-pawn without any loss of time. I would caution you that this and other maxims are not to be blindly followed. In chess, as in life, rules must often be swept aside. In general, though, the principles governing sound chess play do make wonderful guideposts, especially in the opening, the middle game and the ending. The best attacking piece is the king's bishop, says Tarish, so white puts this piece to work and clears the way for early castling. The bishop seizes a valuable diagonal in the center and attacks Black's f7 pawn. This pawn is particularly vulnerable, as it is guarded by one piece only, the king. It is not unusual, even early in the game, to sacrifice a piece for this pawn, so that the king in capturing it is uprooted, driven into the open and exposed to a violent attack. Is this the most suitable square for the bishop? Let us look at the alternatives. 3. Bishop b4. Inferior, because Black's bishop takes no part in the struggle for control of the center and has little scope here. 3. Bishop d6. Poor, since the d-pawn is blocked, and the other bishop may have trouble coming out. 3. Bishop e7. Not too bad, because the bishop looks out on two diagonals and is well placed for defense. At e7, the bishop has made only one step forward, but it has been developed once it has left the back rank. The important thing to remember is that every piece must be put in motion. The strongest developing move is 3, Bishop c5. On this excellent square the bishop commands an important diagonal, exerts pressure on the center and attacks a weak pawn. This deployment conforms to two golden rules for opening play. Place each piece as quickly as possible on the square, where it is most effective. Move each piece only once in the opening. White's primary object is to establish two pawns in the center, and with this move he intends to support an advance of the d-pawn. After 5 d4, attacking bishop and pawn, Black must reply 5, e takes d4. The recapture by 6, c takes d4, leaves White with two pawns in control of the center. His secondary aim is to bring the queen to b3, intensifying the pressure on the f7 pawn. These are its virtues, but there are drawbacks to 4, c3. In the opening, pieces not pawns should be moved. In advancing to c3, the pawn occupies a square that should be reserved for the b1 knight. Very good. Black develops a piece while parrying the threat. If White persists in playing 5, d4, the continuation 5, e takes d4. 6, c takes d4. Queen takes e4 check wins a pawn. The capture with check gives white no time to recover the pawn, and an extra pawn, everything else being equal, is enough to win the game. White postpones the advance of the d-pawn and moves his king to a safer place. Castle early in the game, preferably on the kingside. Strengthens the center and supports the e-pawn and bishop. Now the c8 bishop can get into the game, with the hope that black will exchange pawns. This would leave white with an impressive lineup in the center, while the c3 square is then available for his knight. If now, 6e takes d4, 7, c takes d4, queen takes e4, white punishes the pawn, snatching by 8, rook, e1, pinning the queen. But black need not capture. Now that his e-pawn is secure, the bishop simply retreats, still bearing down on the white center from its new position. Despite its formidable appearance, white's pawn center is shaky. The d-pawn is attacked 3 times, and white must keep a triple guard on it while trying to complete his development. On 7, queen b3, which he contemplated earlier, the queen's protection is removed, while on 7, knight bd2, it is cut off. Meanwhile, white is faced with the threat of 7, bishop g4 pinning and thereby rendering useless one of the pawn supports. Before committing himself to a definite course of action, white sets a little trap. A tricky move, but an illogical one. White threatens an attack on the bishop by 8, a5. If then 8, bishop takes a5, 9, d5 strikes at the knight protecting the bishop. After the reply 9, knight d8. White captures by 10, rook takes a5, winning a piece. Should black, after a5, played knight takes a5, the continuation 9, rook takes a5, bishop takes a5, 10, queen a4 check nets white 2 pieces for a rook. But what right has white to play combinations when his development is so backward? An attack such as he initiates here is premature and should not succeed. Develop all your pieces before starting any combinations. Black prepares a retreat for his bishop. This does not violate the precept about making unnecessary pawn moves in the opening. Development is not meant to be routine or automatic, threats must always be countered first. If more justification is needed, consider that black's loss of time is compensated for by white's fruitless 7a4 move. There is just a wee chance that black will be tempted to take the pawn. But black does not bite. A coffee house move. Weak players make this move instinctively in dire dread of having a piece pinned. It is better to submit to the pin, a temporary inconvenience, than to prevent it by a move that loosens the position of the pawns defending the king and weakens the structure permanently. Playing h3 or g3 after castling creates an organic weakness that can never be remedied, as a pawn once advanced cannot retreat, and the position, once altered, cannot be restored. The pawn that has moved forward itself becomes a target for direct attack, while the square it guarded earlier, here it is g3, becomes a landing field for the enemy's troops. You should never, unless of necessity or to gain an advantage, move the pawns in front of the castled king, says Tarrasch. For each pawn move loosens the position. Alekhine expresses it even more strongly. Always try to keep the 3 pawns in front of your castled king on their original squares as long as possible. Black can now speculate on breaking up white's kingside by removing the h3 pawn, even at the cost of a piece. The recapture tears open the g-file and exposes white's king to attack. This plan is of course not to be put into action until more pieces are brought into play. The knight swings into the fray with an attack on the e-pawn. The move is excellent and conforms with a useful general principle. Develop with a threat whenever possible. Remember that to meet the threat the opponent must drop whatever else he is doing. White exchanges, and opens up lines for his pieces. Unfortunately, this reacts in black's favor, in accordance with the rule in these cases. Open lines are to the advantage of the player whose development is superior. Much stronger than taking with the pawn. The knight on e5, beautifully centralized, radiates power in every direction, something a pawn cannot do. The disappearance of white's d-pawn has benefited black's bishop, hidden away at a7. Its range has been extended, so that it now controls the whole of the long diagonal leading to white's f2 pawn, and the king is just behind the pawn. What shall white do now? He has done nothing to relieve the plight of his e-pawn. It is still attacked by one of black's knights, while his bishop is threatened by the other. This looks plausible, as white gets rid of a powerfully placed piece, but in making this exchange, white's own f3 knight, the best defender of the castled position, also comes off the board. The importance of holding on to the knight in such situations was pointed out by Steinitz more than 70 years ago, when he said, "Three unmoved pawns on the kingside in conjunction with a minor piece form a strong bulwark against an attack on that wing." Tarrasch attests to the valuable properties of the f3 knight with a simple emphatic statement: "A knight at f3, f6 for black, is the best defense of a castle position on the kingside." Observe that white's knight has disappeared completely from the board, but black's knight has been replaced by another piece. This new piece, the queen, is magnificently posted at e5. She dominates the center, bears down on the hapless e-pawn, and is poised for quick action on any part of the board. How does white solve the problems posed by the position of the menacing queen and the attacks on his e-pawn? He would love to dislodge the queen by 12 f4, but unfortunately the move is illegal. Can he save the pawn? Desperately hoping that black will snatch up the pawn by 12, knight takes e4, when there would follow 13. Knight takes e4, queen takes e4, 14, rook e1, and the pin wins the queen. But black is not interested in grabbing pawns. His positional superiority is great enough to justify looking for a combination that will conclusively force a win. His bishops exert terrific pressure on their respective diagonals, even though one bishop is still undeveloped. Each of them attacks a pawn shielding the king. Black's queen is ready to swing over to the kingside, while the knight can leap in if more help is needed. Black controls the center, a condition that, Capablanca says, is essential for a successful attack against the king. In short, black is entitled to a winning combination as reward for his methodical positional play. The question is there a target available for the explosion of this pent-up power? Yes, indeed. The h-pawn, which innocently moved to h3 to prevent a pin. Black removes the offending pawn, fit punishment for the crime of weakening white's position and betraying his king. White must capture the bishop or be a pawn down with nothing to show for it. A crashing entrance. Notice how black has exploited the two main defects of 9, h3. He captured the h-pawn itself and utilized the g3 square, weakened by its advance, as a point of invasion. White may not take the queen, as his f-pawn is pinned. Black destroys another defending pawn, further exposing the king. White's only move. In return for the sacrificed bishop, black has two pawns in the attack. Threatens mate on the move. White must guard against the threat at h2, or give his king a flight square. If he tries to give his king room by 16, rook e1, he falls into 16, bishop takes f2 checkmate. Hence, to guard h2, and stop mate by the queen. How does black conclude the attack? He reasons it up this way: I have captured two of the pawns near the king. If I can remove the third pawn, it will deprive the king of the last shred of protection, and he will be helpless. This last defender, the f-pawn, is attacked by my knight and bishop, and protected by his rook and king. I must either drive off one of the defenders, or attack the pawn a third time. Perhaps I can do both. Again, exploiting the circumstance that the f-pawn is pinned, black attacks it with a third piece, the queen. The king must move to the corner and desert the pawn. Only the rook defends it now, against an attack by queen, knight and bishop. The pawn must fall, and with it the game. Covers the king's flight square, g1, and prevents him from returning there in answer to a check. Black's threat was 18, queen h3 check. 19, knight h2. Queen takes h2 checkmate. As 18, rook takes f2, runs into 18, knight takes f2 checkmate. There was no escape.